Before we dive in and start creating our own custom entities, I want to take a look at how we can interact with the entity types that already exist in Drupal core. There's a bunch of them like nodes, comments, users, and so forth. We're going to look at using functions like entity underscore load or entity underscore extract underscore IDs in order to gather information about an entity or load an entity in a generic way. That way I can do things like load an entity even if I don't know what type it is, or I can find out what the entity's unique ID is without knowing what type it is. This is important for being able to write code that can work with any type of entity in Drupal. I'm going to start by just doing a quick explanation of this entity demo.module. You can grab these files off of the video node on our website and follow along. We're going to use this as a place to write some example code in order to play around a little bit with things that we can do with the entity API in Drupal core. The module contains a .info file and a .module file. The .module file has one simple hook implementation of hook menu, and it's defining two paths. One path that you can go to in order to see a list of all of the demonstrations that are part of the module, and a second path that contains a page where we're going to do our actual demonstration. You can see that this is calling back to the page callback function, entity demo underscore page 1, right here, and that this function needs to live inside of this file, entity demo.demos1.inc, which is already created for us. However, there's no code inside of it, so we'll go ahead and create a new function. Like so. So now we've got a place that we can mess around and write some code that will output something to the screen. You've probably seen this before in Drupal if you've done any module development. Node equals node load, and then the ID of a node that you would like to load. And just to prove that this is working, we'll return some string for our page, and we'll print the node using the DSM function from the devel module. So if I switch back over to my site where I've already got the entity demos module enabled, I can navigate to the page that is this new page that we just created, and it's loading, well, it looks like a non-existent node. If I get the ID of an actual node from our site, like number 75, we can go back and try this again. So I'll change this to be 75, which is the ID of a node entity on our site. Refresh the page, and there you can see it's used the node load function to load a node entity with the given ID. Pretty standard. And this convention works great if we already know the type of entity which we're trying to load. If I already know that I'm looking for a node, or I already know that I'm looking for a user, I can use the node load or user load functions. I can look up the documentation for node load, for example, on api.drupal.org, and just use that in order to load a node with a given ID. If I dig into this a little bit though, you'll notice that the node load function in the end ends up being a wrapper for a function named entity underscore load. And this is the one that we're going to look at a little bit more in depth. Entity underscore load is a function that can be used almost identically to the node load or user load functions to load an entity, but it can load an entity of any type. I don't need to know if there's a function specific for loading this entity. I can just call entity load, tell it what the type is, and the ID, and go ahead and load it. So back in our code, rather than this line here, which says node equals node load 75, I'm going to remove that, and I'm going to put in entity equals entity load. I need to specify an entity type, so node, and an array of entity IDs that I would like to load, like so. And this will effectively do the same thing as the node load that we had just done. Let's verify that. So it returns a single element, and that is this node class that we just loaded via node load, but now we're loading it via a more generic wrapper function. So what's so useful about this? Imagine that in our code, we had a scenario that looks something a bit more like this. What if our function took 2 arguments? It just accepted a random ID and a random type. Any other module could call this function and expect it to perform its output by passing in a known entity ID and a known entity type. So I can write code in my module now that doesn't care what you pass in for entity type. It'll work regardless. Instead of having to do something like check if type is comment, use comment load, if type is node, use node load, I can just do something like entity load type ID. And I'll get back the entity. This is a pattern you see a lot in Drupal core. Another thing that you'll see a lot, because the entity load function is actually capable of loading multiple entities at once, if I were to pass in more than one ID, it's returning an array of all the entities that it loaded. If I know I'm only asking for a single entity, you see this a lot. Entity reset entity, which is just saying, give me the first object inside of this array. I know that there's only one, so I'm going to reassign the value of the variable entity to that object. And now I've got my entity object, and I can go ahead and work with it however I want to. Here's another common scenario that you run into from time to time. What if my code is given an object named $entity, but I have no idea what that entity type is, or which key on that entity is the unique ID, or how to find out that information? There's a handy function named entity extract IDs that we can make use of. Let's look up the documentation for that real quick. The entity extract IDs function takes 2 arguments, an entity type and an entity object. So as long as I have an object and a type, which again is a really common scenario in Drupal, I can pass it into this function and it'll extract all the information I need. Things like the actual ID, the revision ID if it exists, also tell me what bundle this belongs to if that exists. So back in our code, I can make use of this entity extract IDs function, which returns an array of the ID of the entity, the revision ID, and the bundle. So if I wanted that information in my code, I might do something like this. So now I'm able to extract the actual ID, the unique ID, the version ID if revisions are enabled, and the bundle if this entity has bundles, without having to know those pieces of information beforehand. This is another thing that Drupal does a lot in order to allow us to write code that's generic and can work with any entity type. As long as I know the type and I have the entity object, I can get this other meta information out of it. Patterns like this are what make it possible for modules like the recurly module or organic groups to perform their actions on any entity type. As long as they're given an entity type and the entity object, they can deal with the rest.